Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. Today on the show, we're going to be doing a prologue critique. We've done first page critiques on the show plenty of times. We've also done some stuff with prologues too. And we have a whole episode about prologues, when they work, when they don't. Over here at Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, we don't mind a decent prologue. They are just risks. You know, a lot of literary agents and editors and publishers don't love them. A lot of readers don't love them. That's not always fair, though. It's usually something that happens at the expense of authors who don't have a ton of credibility yet. So there are fantasy authors, right, who for sure, like, they get away with prologues all the time because they have huge fan bases. And those fan bases are like, well, my favorite author, like, if they write a prologue, I don't care. But if it's a debut author or somebody they don't know as well, there are a lot of readers who kind of turn their noses up at prologues, sometimes unfairly, sometimes deservedly. I've read so many prologues where I've been like, that's not it. But we're going to find out if this prologue is it. I have not read the prologue yet. As usual, our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons, went ahead and just sent this to me. So I'm going to be opening it up for the first time. I've only seen the headline and, you know, the post. It's a Reddit post. It's going to be in the Fantasy Writers subreddit. I'm going to share it with you all right now so we can get into it. Okay. So this is it. All right. Prologue, A Ballad of Swords. 587 words. Okay, so that's not too long. We should be able to get through this just all right. Okay, let's go through it. This is a draft for a prologue of a story I wrote. Hope for feedback. Thanks. All right, before we get started, I will say that I'm going to let you know as I'm reading this where I would stop reading as a reader. Not necessarily an editor. As an editor, I would, of course, go through the whole thing. But if I was just picking this up at a bookstore, right, I would let you know where I would stop reading. And also, I've mentioned this before on first page critiques, prologue critiques. Please, if you are somebody who wants to write into the show, like email us and send us something that you'd like us to critique. And if you also want to post something publicly like this person, please give us more details. And just a quick version of this. Don't just tell us the name of the story, please. Kind of simulate the experience of going into the bookstore. I don't just like go in and the book is blank and then I open it right to the page, right? There's always a cover design. It's in a particular section. And that just helps me frame the book around like my head. So for example, if I go in, I see the cover design, I have a sense that like maybe this is epic fantasy, adult fantasy, historical fantasy, something. But here, all I have is the title. And I'm just saying it's more helpful for us. It's going to be more helpful for you because our feedback is probably going to be more accurate, to be totally honest. I won't have to make as many assumptions. So always want to remind folks of that if they are interested, of course, in having their stuff evaluated. So, okay, let's actually get into it here. And should I do a voice? Will you all hate me if I do a voice? All right, I'm going to do a voice. Here we go. It was deathly cold. The jagged peaks of the mountains impaled the dark clouds, and the twisted trees on the dead soil stood guardian over the barren wasteland of the dead island. Black, the sky looked like it was afflicted by the plague, being a reminder of the mysterious tragedy struck upon the once lush utopia. I would probably stop reading here because that's an obvious typo. And look, if you're having grammar typo, stuff like this in your first paragraph, that is a massive red flag to me because this should be the most picked over section of your entire novel. So this is definitely a spot where I would, but let's say this typo wasn't there. I'll let you know where I would stop reading after that. Okay. Now the island was stripped to a horrible rotting corpse of its former self. Across the bleak horizon, a group of people, around 100, hiked up the range of mountains. They had freezing dark plate armor. Another typo because armor is capitalized here, and I don't think it should be because dark plate wasn't capitalized. So pointing that out as well. What were as spiked as the cliffs surrounding them, strung upon their lashed bodies. Their helmets look like rusted lanterns. This is where I would stop reading. But instead of light lit in them, the look of death was sunken in their soulless eyes. Yeah, this is definitely where I would have stopped reading. I'll explain why once I'm through the whole thing. One had a large dark greatsword resting on his shoulder, while his body crookedly moved up the cliffside in agony. Another wielded a great hammer rivaling the stature of his humongous body. All the people looked like reanimated corpses, some say revived by the supposed dark magic that infected the island. All but one didn't share this fate. He was tall, lean, walking so upright it could be mistaken for foolish pride.
His eyes glowed a little more than the others. His soul wasn't as lost as the rest. His damned fate had not taken over his body and soul yet. Also, unlike his companions, his breastplate had a red mark, what looked like a wound from a claw. I think they mean that looked. Leading the front was another one of these men. He was as tall and as covered as his peers. His armor was a little richer, but not very dissimilar. So once again, armor has been capped here. So I guess that was intentional, but it doesn't come off as intentional. 2 cents, because why would armor be capitalized? If you do something like this, and sorry, I should just keep going, but I don't want to forget this. If you do something like this where you do like a stylistic change for the sake of it, you kind of have to pay it off quickly so we understand what you're trying to do. Just point that out. It was unusual for a leader of a battalion as large as this to be so resemblant to their followers. The marching came to an abrupt halt as they finally reached it to the summit. Yeah, so finally is capitalized here too. This is very strange. Again, I think this really needs to be proofread several times because this is definitely tripping me up quite a bit. They slowly coiled around the peak like snakes, and the leader stood at the utmost tip of the mountain, gazing down to his comrades. The leader began his speech. Reapers, we are here to carry the duty of death on our shoulders and deliver its will to all that must see our blade. That oath stands all the same on this night, like all the other ones that passed. Though today we don't just spread death, today we forge the shield of man. Temper their blade to fight the evil to come. The continent under the Empire's rule has made it weak, lustful, and greedy. If we don't act now, the balance of life and death will be to the fate of a whim. We will show the land death before they must face the horror of annihilation from the hand of the Outers. The group of reapers' voices were not heard once throughout. Not even a whisper left their mouths, silent as a crypt. The leader continued. Kneel now, brethren. Dedicate your sword and yourselves to the king, Death. Like a wave, all the men fell onto their knees, kneeling not just towards their leader, but their unmoving duty to their one and all. With their weapons one with the ground, planted into the dry dirt, they began their decree in unison. We are not death. Our swords are. We are not death. Our armor is. We are not death. We carry its will. We are the reapers of the West, harbingers of death. As their last words left their mouths, the leader told his final proclamation. Reapers, we sail north. Yes, so lots and lots of grammar issues here. And that's always going to be an issue because, yeah, the more grammar issues I see, like if you're putting something out there to folks, for sure, you're going to have some mistakes. But when there is an egregious amount, that just sort of tells me you are rushing for feedback. And that's not good. You shouldn't rush to feedback. You want people to evaluate your stuff when it's at its best, or at least as close to its best as possible. So let's pick this thing apart. Definitely, this is a prologue. I already kind of mentioned where I stopped reading. This is a prologue that definitely would not work for me overall. Not because I have a bias against prologues, as I already said, but the main thing, we have, first of all, this super long paragraph here. It's the first paragraph, and it's way too long. This paragraph is, I have it chunked right here, but it's lots of sentences. And the reason I stopped right here, their helmets look like rusted lanterns, but instead of light in them, the look of death was sunken in their soulless eyes. This sentence is way too similar to everything else, the vibe of everything else you're doing. The idea of like their helmets look like this. They had freezing armor. A group of people, around 100, hiked up the range of mountains. That one's okay. There was something else. The sky looked like it was afflicted by plague. You are doing the same thing over and over again. That's the issue here. And so that tells me that you probably haven't read this aloud to kind of get the idea of the flow, or at least you haven't, read it aloud in a way to kind of really critique it for yourself. And that's kind of an issue. It's this kind of thing where you have your first paragraph is so important. You're trying to hook the reader, and here nothing's hooking me. It's just, this looks like this looks like that. And for many readers, it's going to come across as very boring. Now, for you writing it, it's not boring because you have everything in your head and you're like, this is exciting to you, right? But you always have to remember to put yourself in the head of the reader themselves, and you have to sell them. And so you have to do a lot more work. You have to kind of mix up your techniques and a lot more in order to justify the person giving you their time, right? And another thing to that too is that this sort of tells me that if you are doing a lot of the same like repetitive like words and style and phrasing,
that it's going to be a whole book of that. And so that's why for me, I'm like, I don't want to keep reading this because I feel like I'm just not going to get something out of it for myself. So that's like the first thing out of the bat. But let's take this piece by piece. I want to start with the title, and I will get into some of the stuff I'd like here for sure. So I'm gonna give some compliments. Don't worry, I'm not gonna be super mean, but I am gonna be a little harsh because that's why we're here. We do for prologues, we're extra harsh because prologues are a tougher sell, and you got to do them really well because the people who like prologues, they want them to be really good. The people who don't like prologues, you have to work that much extra harder to convince them, right? So okay, the title. Maybe it's a working title, but I'll still give some feedback on it all the same. I know a lot of people say, including me, the title isn't so important that you should fixate on it too much. But if it is a title you are considering as the one that you're going to go with like long term, I will say it's serviceable, but it's pretty generic, quite frankly. So if you use the word ballad, that implies, right, so lyrical storytelling, usually something implying like a mournful or heroic tale. But the execution of the prologue leans really heavily into this kind of dark fantasy militarism, and that doesn't quite match for me. Prologue title, you're giving us a lot of information. This stuff should feel a little bit more connected. And, compare this to, for example, The Name of the Wind. That is a poetic yet mysterious title. And when you read the beginning of the novel, even though you don't yet know exactly how the magic system works, which is what the title is referring to, it does match the flow, the prose, the poeticism of the early parts of the novel. Another example would be The Lies of Locke Lamora. That's a kind of playful sort of title, also very evocative. And again, that's something that those early chapters definitely pay off. It doesn't feel super disconnected. So I'd say this title, it really lacks that kind of hook that some of the better, so it's like the amazing fantasy novels we all look up to are able to do, right? So I would definitely suggest something sharper, something a little bit more specific. Keep working on it. Titles are something you don't have to figure out right away, of course, but that's just my 2 cents on that. Okay, so let's start with some analysis here. I want to start with the prose and some of the imagery that you're using. We're going to talk about some of the good stuff, some of the bad stuff, and then whatever else. Strengths. Okay, so I'd say there's a grim atmospheric intent here. I'm always about that. I like grim, dark stuff. I think you as the author, what you're trying to do is you're trying to establish a bleak, death-infused world. And in some places, your prologue is definitely achieving that. So you are achieving what you're setting out to do here, which is great. I think the second line, the image of like the mountains impaling the clouds, that's nice. It's not the most innovative kind of prose in the world, but that is the kind of thing that I think you should lean into in terms of your writing. That was a nice kind of like vivid imagery thing. I got it right away. Great. And the nice thing about that too is when you use the word impale, it's harsh, it's violent, it matches the rest of your prologue. Awesome. The idea of the warriors who have become kind of husks of themselves, that's pretty compelling. That's something that immediately gets me a little bit like curious. It has me asking questions. And then the one who isn't fully lost yet, it's great. That's a hook that is going to work for a lot of people and maybe for a protagonist, depending on what you're going to try to do. I'm assuming maybe not. But it's kind of like with Force Awakens. What's the hook of that one, right? Is one of the stormtroopers kind of like secedes, and realizes that they're not going to be a stormtrooper anymore. It's that kind of technique, and it works there for the same reason. We immediately sympathize and connect with Finn because he is the only one who's not fully, the stormtrooper bad guy. So okay, let's get into some of the problems here. I think I already kind of touched on this, but I think the imagery that you're going for, I'd call it, I think it's overwrought and it is repetitive. So you have this line, black the sky looked like it was afflicted by the plague, being a reminder of the mysterious tragedy struck upon the once lost utopia. Now the island was stripped to a horrible rotting corpse of its former self. Okay, so this really is, for me at least, this is a grammatical nightmare in some ways. It doubles back on itself unnecessarily. I think we get it. Everything is dead. Using 3 metaphors in one sentence to do one thing is really tedious for readers. It feels nice when you're writing it because metaphors are fun and you want to get the message across. But if you overwhelm the reader with the same thought multiple times, it's a little bit much and it's going to lose people or it's going to frustrate people. So I would suggest editing it down a bit. I'll just take that right now. It's like 3 lines. You can definitely bring it down to 1 line, maybe 1.5, and it's still going to have, it's going to have way more impact if it's a little bit more brief and punchy. I would also say, I definitely talked about this a bit. The syntax here, the construction, it's unpolished and it's a bit clunky. So, you had the line there like black, the sky looked like it was afflicted by the plague. This sounds like a translation mistake to me. So I don't know if the writer here, if English is their first language, we don't have that info. So I'm not going to assume either way, but it does come across that way. Depending on what you're going for here. There's also this line, they had freezing dark plate armor, and armor was all capped, or not all caps, but capped. What were as spiked as the cliffs surrounding him. I think what you're trying to say is they wore dark plate armor spiked like the cliffs around them. So yeah, that's just something, it trips me up, even if it's something you're intending to do, you don't want to intend readers to get caught up on syntax. You just don't. There's another line here. One had a large dark greatsword resting on his shoulder, while his body crookedly moved up the cliffside in agony. So I think, first of all, large dark greatsword is total overkill. It's either large or it's great, right? I know like there are great swords, and so like that's what you would probably want to say. But if you say it's a great sword, we know it's large. And also, especially because, it's fantasy. So like most people are going to get it. His body crookedly moved. Bodies don't move themselves. People move, right? So you're trying to say his body's doing, and it's maybe you're trying to do it for an aesthetic reason, but it just kind of, it's awkward. It's a bit clunky because my mind doesn't immediately get what you're going for. So a cleaner version of this, for example, would be one carried a massive greatsword, and greatsword should be one word so you understand that it's not an adjective for the sword, but it's a type of sword, on his shoulder. So I'll say it again. So one carried a massive greatsword on his shoulder, climbing with, and then you could fill in the blank however you would want to dress that up stylistically, right? Okay, next thing I would say, there's a lot of word overuse. I mentioned this before with looked, like this looked like that, this looked like that. Another thing that's overused a lot is death and dead. You use death and dead something like 7-8 times in this excerpt. It's way overkill. Get it, dead, overkill. But you also, some of the words that construct your phrases, so looked, as I mentioned, use was and were, it's weakening your prose because you're overdoing it. It's passive construction. When you say this was that, this were that, especially overusing it is not great because these are passive words, and there are other ways for you to, through prose, bring images into our heads and make the prose just have more variety, have a little bit more life to them, more energy. When it's always just this looks like this, and then this was that, it feels like you're reading a textbook. It feels like you're reading definitions instead of being immersed, right? That's what you want to go for. There was a lot of inconsistent spelling in this. I think there was like one time where armor was spelled with a U. They might have... because they use towards at one point. Towards is kind of like UK. So in the UK, they have an S at the end, like backwards, forward. I guess forward wouldn't be an example of that, but towards, right? But in US spelling, the correct grammar, and a lot of people make this mistake, it should be toward or, backward, that kind of thing. Now, if it's UK spelling, though, and this person is UK or, something adjacent, then I shouldn't say adjacent, but you know what I mean? Like, that same kind of deal. Then don't. As long as you're consistent, it's fine. That's the thing. It's like if it's sometimes UK spelling, sometimes US spelling, sometimes something else, that's when it starts to be, strange and difficult to parse for the reader. And then there were like lots of misspellings, a lot of incorrect usages. The lust utopia, I don't know if you mean lost utopia. I don't mean if you were trying to say like lush utopia or something like that. There were a couple of phrases where what was being used instead of maybe like that or which. There was something like kneel no brethren, where I think you meant kneel now brethren, stuff like that. It's all over this piece, so it definitely needs to be proofread. Okay, so let's talk about some more macro stuff. I've been really harping on prose and everything like that, but even if you get all the prose right, what about this thing in terms of its development, its structure, and how it works opening a novel? That's really, really important and hopefully helpful for a lot of you listening, because that's where a lot of this advice is going to be, a little bit more relevant for a lot of you. And to start off, like I said, prologues are tricky. They have to justify their existence by doing a lot of things. Some prologues establish a lot of essential backstory, and you have to do it in an engaging way. So The Eye of the World, Wheel of Time, that's really what that prologue is trying to do. It's essentially setting up something that's essential to the plot and the backstory of these events that shape the entire novel. Other prologues are really good or really helpful in introducing some kind of mystery or foreshadowing events, right? Game of Thrones very much is like this. The Way of Kings is very much like this. And then also prologues, if you are really trying to be a little bit different, your prologue can try to contrast with the main story. So, for example, if you have the first chapter being about the humble beginning of a likable protagonist, then using a sort of grand historical tragedy as your prologue is a contrast, but it's a helpful contrast. It's like a cold open that's like, these are the big, big stakes. And then you have kind of the humble beginning of the protagonist. That's also similar to Game of Thrones as well, because we go to Bran's perspective right after this kind of like horror fantasy thing that happens at the very beginning. As for this excerpt, the Ballad of Swords prologue, this really doesn't do any of those three things from what I can tell. All we're really getting is this vague sort of military ceremony, some kind of world building that's kind of half-hearted, to be honest. And I don't have any emotional connection to any of the characters, not even the leader who is talking, because there's nothing kind of like emotionally hooky about that character. They're just sort of talking. And the stuff they're talking about is a little generic here. So let's compare this to The Lies of Locke Lamora, where the prologue of that novel, definitely read it if you haven't, it introduces us to this sort of like clever orphan who immediately gets to demonstrate his skills. It sets the tone for the whole novel, and it immediately grabs you. I've mentioned this before, I think in the prologues episode, that you have a good prologue when that prologue can work on its own, and you don't need the rest of the book to have a satisfying reading experience with that prologue. It's not that a prologue should always be some kind of like short story necessarily, but you can try that. That's a fun technique to try. Make your prologue so that it does kind of function as either a short story or as flash fiction, something under 1,000 words, which is what this would be, right? So like one singular scene. And if it can stand on its own, that's a sign that your prologue is going to be fun to read for the reader, because it's going to feel like, oh, cool, that had a beginning, middle, end. Now we're going to move on to this next thing, but I don't feel like the prologue left me hanging. That's the idea that you're going for. And in this case, I think with this prologue, I don't know what's at stake, right? I don't know why I should care about these warriors. I don't know what their oath really is. Why are they marching north? Why does the protagonist, if that's who they are, why are they not fully dead yet? Why does that matter? Without grounding these details in some kind of central conflict, this prologue feels like lore dumping instead of storytelling. And that's the main reason why a lot of people kind of give prologues a bad rap, because a lot of authors who are just trying to do some fun world building, they're just trying to use their prologue to set things up. They have the right intentions, but what happens so often is that these are lore dumping exercises where it's like, I want to just sort of put a lot of stuff in here and see what happens, instead of treating it as a story in its own right. And that's a tough thing to avoid doing, but there are ways to fix this. You can start closer to the personal conflict, right? Who is the one man not yet fully lost? What's he thinking? Can we get into their shoes a little bit and really see this through their eyes? You can also try to introduce some kind of immediate problem rather than just sort of bringing us into this sort of vague speech. And to that end, you should try to give us specific states, right? So this thing called the outers, it's name dropped, but we don't really know what they are. We don't know why we should fear them. We aren't giving any like examples, or we're not even being told, right? There's show don't tell. In this case, we're not getting either in a lot of senses. And so that's not great. We need that stuff in order for us to be invested. And then aside from all of that, we can talk about the dialogue here too. We have like the military speech. There was this, I'll read a little bit of it. Reapers, we are here to carry the duty of death on our shoulders and deliver its will to all that must see our blade. Honestly, when I've read this, I was kind of thinking this feels like a bit of a knockoff of Warhammer 40K. It's trying to be really epic in that sense, but it doesn't really have a lot of rhythm and natural flow. I would play with this a bit more to kind of get that flow a little bit better. It should really beat, really study speeches and presentations by people throughout history. Dictators, of course, but you can also go for the more like morally righteous ones too. So you're not just inundating yourself with negativity, but that kind of stuff can really help you understand like the pitch and the cadence to these things a little bit better, so you can infuse it in your writing. So I would say like, what are some iconic phrases, right? From like A Song of Ice and Fire, when they give a speech in that, there's that line I love, like, night gathers and now my watch begins. That is instantly iconic. I don't have to say that that's A Song of Ice and Fire. I say that and people understand what I'm talking about, right? Because it sticks out. And also, there's just something in Dune, the line like fear is the mind killer, right? You're playing a little bit more with details there. You're playing a little bit more with like, ooh, that's intriguing. And it feels like a person trying to instill an emotional reaction in somebody else. And another thing too that makes this memorable is that it's short and punchy. Like when speeches, you do the speeches in general, you want them to be short and punchy, because if you try to do super long sentences in a speech in real life, right, it's too much for people to follow. You're just like talking. But if you're short, punchy, you help the person listening understand what's being emphasized, and everything else is kind of background, and it just helps them remember it. It helps instill in them the point that you're trying to make. So yeah, I would kind of break this up a little bit, like reapers, we bear death's burden, period. Add some punctuation, kind of separate things. Tonight we forge that, whatever it is. So that's my advice there. There was also this line here too, I want to point out: the continent under the Empire's rule has made it weak, lustful, and greedy. So again, this is an example of telling, not showing. You did tell, at least in this part, but telling us that the Empire is weak, right? Show us its decadence, through action or through an example. You can tell us like the Empire's rule has made it weak. Keep going. How so, right? We don't need an example right there in the moment, but we do need a little bit of like, the Empire used to be like this, and now this happens. Like, be a little bit more illustrative, demonstrative in that way, because that's going to be something that, like, if you use examples of this stuff after you make the claim, that's what's going to resonate with the person listening to the speech. And then what else was there? The kneel now, brethren, dedicate your sword and yourselves to the King Death. If King Death, I thought like maybe it was supposed to be King Death instead of like to the death, King of Death, like maybe King of Death. I wasn't sure. But if King Death was supposed to be this, like, I don't know, proper noun, it's lowercase, so I don't know. That's a potentially cool idea, but I need to kind of figure out, I couldn't figure out what you were trying to do there, so it needs a little bit better execution, right? Does this entity literally exist? And if that's the case, definitely try to flesh it out, because that's something where you do get a little bit of curiosity. You do get a little bit of that intrigue that can help your prologue, right? So there you go. So yeah, anything else? I think like the idea of a doomed battalion walking like corpses, it's a good visual, right? I think like Pirates of the Caribbean, it's one of my favorite visuals, is when all the skeletons are underwater. They used it in the trailer for a reason, right? That's just an immediately like cool visual thing. So you have something there. The whole thing with like the one man who isn't fully lost yet, that's a potentially strong character hook. You just need to carry it out in a way that kind of gets us into the story more. And I'd say overall, what you're doing right, you have a raw intensity here. It's there. I can see it. The problem is that it's buried under a lot of cluttered prose and kind of this unclear focus. You can fix those things. You can definitely improve this a huge deal, like tenfold at least. So yeah, there you go. I think that if a literary agent looked at this, I'd say, like, literary agents are so harsh. They would probably say like, this has a lot of words, but it's not saying enough. Too many words saying too little. I think a lot of literary agents would say that this prologue doesn't really justify itself. And then, yes, they would run away from the syntax issues, the grammar errors, and all of that. So it's an ambitious concept, an ambitious attempt, but it's overwritten in too many ways. But yeah, you can cut down on the clutter here. You can sharpen your sentence structure, and you can really make us care about what's happening. It's just going to take a little bit of extra work here. And look, I'm a sucker for dark fantasy. I hope this one works out for the author. Maybe we can look at, looking at the time here. We can look at a comment or two. That could be fun. So let me bring up the comments. So, there's only like one comment, so I guess we'll just do that. This is from My Amaranth 336, and they write, sounds like an interesting concept, but I found the first few paragraphs a little too descriptive and overly dramatic for my taste. I feel a little less is more would help. I would try and strip it back a little and see if you can put the atmosphere across with a few less adjectives. That's just my opinion, though, and easier said than done. Anyhow, good luck. It'll be interesting to see where the story leads. Yeah, I love this feedback, especially because they're giving the caveats, right? It's like, for my taste. I like that, right? It's like, it's being clear that maybe some people want that more flowery prose, but if you are being honest with like, yeah, this is just, not aligning with what I value in a fantasy novel, that's totally valid. And that can be really helpful for this person trying to improve their work. So there you go. All right. Well, thank you to our producer, Natalia Emmons, for finding this prompt for us, for finding this to critique. And thank you so much for the person who put it out there. I hope this was helpful. I know it was probably a bit harsh, but that's the point. That's the goal, right? And I've been doing this for years and years. People do it to my work too. Very sorry. But that's going to do it for me on this one. Going to see you, of course, on the next episode. Not sure exactly what we're going to be doing yet, but I'm sure Natalia is going to find something great for us. And hopefully I'm going to have some stuff coming out pretty soon that's going to be interesting. I think we have some listener stuff too that we want to get to next week if we can. But for now, be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.